I'll keep going. Now, Zfs Breathing. This is probably one of the most important things. If you take anything away from this, I want you to take this away. If you run I/O stat on a Zfs system that's doing a bunch of I/O, you're going to see the disks go 0. The disk will idle. This makes absolutely no sense. It's completely, what the hell's going on? This is what I call Zfs breathing. Okay? Asynchronous writes are grouped into transaction groups. And then they're synced out to disk at regular intervals. This controls the flow of data into disk. Zfs is heavily reliant on DRAM. Right? One of the reasons that hybrid pool is awesome is we have a layer of abstraction there with SSDs. Zfs has more in common with the transactional database than it does with probably most of the file systems you've used in the past. Right? Every single IOP is a transaction. These things are queued into groups and then launched out to physical in these orderly sorts of ways. What you'll see is you'll see a gap between transaction group flushes, these groups of IOs. I kind of think of it generally, they have 3 different kind of staging areas. And I think of it kind of like the Matterhorn, right? You've got one car where you're loading people into the roller coaster, car, right? The other one is kind of going up the ramp, getting ready to go. And the other one is actually zooming around doing its thing, right? You've got these 3 cars constantly moving, right? And one of them is always in that state. And so that's exactly what we have. We have these 3 kind of groups that are going around. One's being packed full of data. Another one's getting ready to go off and flush to disk. And another one's actually writing out to disk. And there's a gap in between. This is a parameter called Zfs Sync Time, and it represents the expected time of a transaction group to flush. So Zfs has an expectation of how quickly a given transaction group should flush out to disk. And by default, it thinks that it should be able to flush everything out to disk in 5 seconds. If it can't, it'll start trying to get a little intelligent and try and figure out why you're pumping data into it so fast or why your physical devices are so slow. We have a TXG timeout for the frequency of the flush set at 30 seconds. This is why you'll see if you do a DD to disk or something like that, you're going to see a lot of I/O for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then you're going to see 20 seconds of idle. The disk is just going to go 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And at the 30-second mark, bam, you see I/O go again. Right? And so if you just watch I/O stat, you're just going to see these weird kind of breathing pattern. And that's exactly what you should see. In some of the older releases, the TXG time to flush was 5 seconds. So you saw it far more often, and that's actually been pushed out to 30 now. This can be monitored via dtrace, and if you dtrace this SPA sync function, you can kind of see when it hits. So read I/O, reads are always synchronous, but ARC absorbs it very, very well, as we saw before in some of those graphs. Another thing gets in here is the Zfs Intent Log for writes. So we call this the Zfs Intent Log. ZIL kind of throws a kink in the works. It's used for synchronous I/O, and it writes out immediately, right? Because you can't wait 30 seconds for a synchronous write to acknowledge. So that kind of gets put on the express lane, goes immediately to disk, and is acknowledged, and your application can keep going. Because of that, it breaks up this beautiful breathing pattern, and that's one of the reasons that in a hybrid pool you have a cache device that extends ARC into an SSD, but you also have this we call a slog, separate intent log, and that allows you to dedicate a high-speed SSD just to taking these kind of synchronous write, intent log entries. And you can make that part of the pool. The beautiful thing about that is the fact that you're not breaking up the I/O to your device, so it keeps things nice and clean. And if you do use hybrid pool, you'll hear them say that you want to use both SLC SSDs and MFC or MLC, the multi So you want to use a really fast SSDs for slog because you want to get those acknowledged as quickly as possible. You can use kind of the slower, cheaper, but bigger SSDs for the purpose of caching. And you can monitor this via trace, of course, by looking at the zil commit writer function. So, the most common reason that people hear about zil is they're told that if they actually want ZFS to be reasonably fast, that you should turn it off. And the reason that is because it turns all of your synchronous I/O into asynchronous I/O. Right? This is kind of like in Linux, right? Everyone would, who starts running NFS on Linux finds that it's really slow until they find the asynchronous property. They turn it asynchronous, and all of a sudden it's really fast, right? And then people tell them, no, you can't do that. The same thing applies here, essentially. Zil disable is as fast as you can get. I've done some benchmarks where I took the fastest SSDs I could find, benchmarked throughput, and then just tried turning it off. And of course, just turning it off is always fastest. Even if you turn zil off, ZFS will always be consistent on disk, right? The thing though is that you're going to lose any write I/O that hasn't been committed to disk, which means at most you're going to lose, you could lose up to a minute of writes, right? Because of the way that things are rolling around. So if you can absorb that and you need it to be super speedy fast, you can turn zil off. There were people who were reporting, particularly in the ZFS internals blog, people were saying that if you turned off zil, that you would most assuredly have these NFS corruption issues. That's not true. Most people who are running ZFS on a thumper will tell you that NFS won't perform on a thumper unless you do turn it off. So lots of people are doing it, and it won't cause client corruption every single time. I've yet to see it cause client corruption, but I'm sure somebody has at some point. And of course, like I said, the problem is really, if you lose power, if somebody pulls the cord out of the back, first, shoot them. Second, shoot the guy who runs the data center for letting them in. But you're going to lose the in-flight data, right? That was uncommitted, so it's sitting there in memory in a transaction group that hasn't been flushed out to disk. So you could lose it. But this could cause logical corruption. It's probably the biggest problem for your databases because it hasn't finished all the follow-on writes or something like that in like your database, redo logs or something like that. But the disk will be entirely consistent. So in some situations, this is a necessary evil. Buy a good UPS. Don't let morons or monkeys into your data center and take your chances, No monkeys. Okay, I/O stat is dead. Dead, 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 dead. Deal with it. So, I/O stat. The active service time and percent busy, right? This is the one most administrators love, percent busy. Hey man, percent busy is like greater than 0. Obviously my system is totally trashed, right? They have diminished meaning because of the fact that we're in a transactional environment, right? By the time you see the I/O and I/O stat, your application's already moved on, It's like a bad girlfriend, right? It's like, it's over. I've moved on. It's done. So I get one laugh. Seriously. It's late. So monitoring the physical devices is not so telling. So what you really want to do is you want to look at the VFS layer, right? You want to look at the logical I/O. How much is actually going on, right? You want to look at what's happening between your application and ZFS. Because kind of like, like a Ferrari, you got this big honking engine in between your application and the disk, right? Don't think that there's a one-to-one correlation. In a lot of traditional file systems, there essentially has been a one-to-one correlation, right? You launch an I/O in your application and you see it on the disk, right? That doesn't apply anymore. So what you're actually seeing in I/O stat going to disk, it's already happened. Your application is already off and running. It's just now taking care of the dirty cleanup work behind it. So what's much more interesting actually tends to be this gap in between transaction syncs. The more your disks are sitting there doing nothing in between transaction group flushes, the more orderly things are going on.